The soldier believed the war was over, but when he stepped through the door, he found it had arrived before him, silent, patient, already rooted in the walls. His daughter was only 8, too innocent to deceive, too quiet to cry for help. The red marks on her arms. They dismissed them as allergies. But Rex knew better. The old dog stayed restless, growling low whenever the house fell too still, as if sensing a threat no one else could name. Then one night, something shifted in the dark and Rex lunged. What they uncovered beneath the floor wasn't just hidden, it was engineered. It was betrayal, and it was buried inside a child whose body had become a war zone. Autumn had crept into Coldridge, Vermont like a quiet trespasser, painting the air with a brittle chill and dyeing the leaves in rust and fire. The town hadn't changed much in 4 years, still wrapped in a hush, its streets lined with porches sagging under the weight of time, and yards strewn with pine needles and forgotten toys. The morning mist hovered low as Logan Harper stepped out of the pickup truck, boots crunching against the gravel, a worn military duffel slung over his shoulder and a leash in his hand. On the other end, walking with a calm yet alert pace, was Rex. Rex was a 4-year-old German shepherd with black and tan fur that had begun to silver around the muzzle. Once a military K9, he bore himself with a watchful stillness, as if still waiting for orders that never came. His left ear had a notch from shrapnel, and his amber eyes held a steady intelligence tinged with something quieter, something hollowed out by grief. He walked slightly ahead of Logan, but never pulled, glancing back often with a caution that had been burned into him during days of gunpowder and metal doors that never opened fast enough. Logan himself was in his late 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, with deep lines carved into his forehead that no amount of time could smooth. His hair, once dark and full, was now clipped short and peppered with gray at the temples. The tan coat he wore was military surplus, and though his movements were precise, there was a sluggishness in his gait, like a man dragging more than just the weight of his pack. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes carried the kind of silence only soldiers understood. The house was smaller than he remembered. A 2-story wooden frame with a wraparound porch, once painted sage green, now faded to something more like dust. Windows were closed, curtains drawn. The front steps creaked under his weight as he knocked. It was Maggie who answered. She appeared in the doorway with a hesitant expression, her brown hair pulled into a loose bun that made her look older than her 32 years. She was of average height and build, dressed in a plain gray cardigan and jeans, her features soft but distant, as if caught somewhere between memory and fatigue. Maggie had once been full of energy, pursuing a promising career in bioecology, but something had shifted a few years ago, something she never explained. Whatever it was, it dulled her eyes and stilled her voice. She married Logan the year Evie turned 4, not out of romance, not exactly. It was more like an agreement built from shared grief and unanswered questions. She looked at him for a long second, the way one might examine a photograph from a life once lived. Her voice came quiet and cautious, saying she hadn't expected to see him so soon. He answered simply that he'd said he would come back. When she motioned toward the interior, explaining that Evie was in her room, he stopped her with a slight gesture. He would go himself. Inside, the house smelled sharp disinfectant clung to the air like a film. The hardwood floors were clean, but the cleanliness felt obsessive, not comforting. Framed photos of Sarah and Evie still lined the mantel, though their colors had begun to fade under the dim lighting. Sarah had been a tall, slender woman with warm eyes and a quiet grace. She had been patient to a fault, a kindergarten teacher beloved for her calm demeanor. Her fatal car crash had been ruled an accident black ice on a winter road. He climbed the stairs slowly. Rex followed, his paws silent against the polished wood. At the top, Logan paused outside Evie's room. The door was cracked open. Evie Harper, just 8 years old, was sitting on the edge of her bed with a sketch pad in her lap. Her pale blonde hair was long and straight, tangled from sleep, and she wore a loose flannel nightgown that hung awkwardly on her frame. Her limbs were thin, her skin almost translucent in the gray morning light. On her forearms, Logan noticed the red marks immediately scattered and uneven, some looking like insect bites, others more like welts. They trailed from her wrists up to her shoulders, disappearing under the fabric. Evie didn't look up right away. She was scribbling something, pressing the crayon too hard, the paper tearing slightly under her grip. Rex took a step forward and let out a low, uncertain growl. The girl looked up then, her wide blue eyes meeting Logan's with a flicker of recognition. Without a word, she rose and quickly rushed into his arms, wrapping her thin arms around his waist. Logan froze, then dropped to his knees. "Hey," he whispered, his voice catching. "It's me." She didn't say a word, but she held on, tight. Then she looked past him at Rex. The dog stepped forward, cautiously, sniffing the air. Then he stopped, his hackles rising ever so slightly. "His name's Rex," Logan said. "He's here to keep you safe." Her eyes shifted then to Rex. The dog moved closer, sniffed with caution, then sat beside her, his tail twitching once. Logan watched her extend a small hand, and Rex responded. Not with his usual indifference, but with a whine, low and close to mourning. Logan hadn't seen that softness in Rex since before. Before everything. And something inside him wavered. Later that morning, as Maggie moved around the kitchen in practiced silence, the scent of coffee barely managed to cut through the chemical tang still thick in the air, Logan wandered through the house. The bathroom cabinet overflowed with antihistamines, steroid creams, and gauze. On the refrigerator door, a note in Maggie's handwriting read, "Track Evie's episodes, new pattern." The couch cushions showed faint red blotches, as if cleaned too late. The walls had been scrubbed. The baseboards shone, but the scent was still there. Too much, too sharp. From the sink, Logan watched the fog rising beyond the tree line. His mind replayed every detail. The too quiet child, the raw marks on her skin, the way Rex had stiffened in that room. He thought of Maggie's silence, not cold, but heavy, as if she too had been living beneath something she couldn't name. Evie sat at the table, her small finger tracing endless circles on the wood. When she shifted, the sleeve of her nightgown slipped and a flash of red caught the light. Logan's jaw tensed. He had not come home to rest. He had come to find out what was happening to his daughter. The sky that morning hung like wet linen, dull and colorless, its weight pressing down on the town of Coldridge as if time itself had grown heavy. A mist still clung to the hollows behind the house, swirling low among the ferns and the moss-covered stones, and inside the wooden frame of the house, silence gathered like breath before a scream. Logan sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of untouched coffee in his hand, its scent mingling uneasily with the acrid tang of antiseptic that still coated the air. Across from him, Evie traced the edge of a bread crust in slow, concentric patterns, her gaze distant, as if watching something only she could see. Her hair, pale as flax, fell like drapery over her small shoulders, concealing most of her face. She had mentioned it softly, almost absent-mindedly, how the whispers came at night, from beneath the floor. Not voices exactly, she'd said, more like breathing, words without words. Logan hadn't responded then, too focused on the scarring along her forearms and the way Rex had bristled at the base of the stairs. But now, with the day filtering in like a warning, he couldn't shake it. Children imagine things, yes, but Evie didn't. Not like this. On the living room floor, beside her crayons and broken pastels, a fresh drawing lay half hidden beneath a blanket. Logan noticed it as she rose to get juice-dark smudges and pale blue shadows traced into the outline of the house. And beneath it, beneath the floorboards, a black square drawn like a trapdoor. Inside it stood a faceless woman in a blue dress, her arms reaching up. Logan's chest tightened. Sarah used to wear a dress like that, sea glass blue with small embroidered birds. He picked up the drawing, his fingers trembling slightly. For the third night in a row, Rex had slept with his nose pressed to the same spot in the upstairs hallway. He hadn't barked, but his tail had bristled each time Evie approached. Logan had noticed it, first as coincidence, then as habit, now as alarm. That morning, Rex returned from the yard, paws damp and cautious, and dropped something at Logan's feet. A slender glass vial, cloudy and capped in rubber. Logan picked it up carefully. A trace of dried crimson ringed the inside. He sniffed it gently. Something sharp and sterile lingered, metallic and faintly sweet. He'd smelled it before, not on battlefields, but in triage clinics. Not war, but testing. He stared at the vial, then rose and moved to the hallway cabinet where Maggie kept old medical files, scraps from Sarah's treatments, allergy tests, an old immunotherapy trial. A manila envelope slipped free. Logan flipped it open and paused. One page listed an early experimental formula. Solution F3R. Next to it, hand-scrawled in Maggie's clean print. Not for pediatric use. Meanwhile, upstairs, Maggie sat hunched before the small desk in the spare bedroom that now served as her study. The light from the curtained window pooled over her shoulders, softening the sharpness of her silhouette. She stared at the open laptop screen, where an email blinked in unread urgency. The subject line was clinical, almost sterile. Unexpected material transport. Attention required. The sender was unlisted, but the message bore a familiar digital watermark, BioVast Labs. She hadn't seen that insignia in nearly 5 years. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad, then clicked. The message was brief. A query cloaked in deniability. A reference to Lot E47 and a transfer event that shouldn't have reached her jurisdiction. No mention of Evie by name, but the implication slithered beneath the surface like a current under ice. She remembered the last time. The girl's name had been Rachel, 6 years old, already covered in lesions by the time the reports reached Claire. Maggie hadn't listened. Neither had BioVast. Claire had warned them all. Maggie had stayed silent. Now, her breath caught. She reached for the inhaler on the corner of the desk, but paused halfway. Instead, she printed the email, folded it, and moved to the small ceramic fireplace in the room's corner. She lit a match and watched the paper blacken and curl in her hand before dropping it into the ashes. Then, quietly, she opened the home security tablet and checked every camera feed. Hallway, basement door, front porch. Her fingers hovered over the option to delete the last 12 hours, but didn't press it. Across town, inside a small university lab nestled within the biology wing of Vermont State Research Institute, Dr. Claire Monroe adjusted the volume on the flat-screen display mounted above her cluttered workstation. She was in her early 40s with a gaunt elegance that came from years spent chasing patterns under microscopes and avoiding sunlight. Her salt-streaked hair was pulled back into a taut ponytail, exposing the sharp structure of her face, cheekbones like glass ridges, and eyes the color of weathered steel. On the screen, a local morning broadcast cycled through headlines. Agricultural runoff, strange discolorations in forest soil, and then, quietly, a report on increased pediatric admissions with unknown dermal reactions. No footage, just stock images of hospitals and vague narration. But Claire's posture stiffened. She muted the anchor and scrolled through her own data logs. She had been tracking anomaly clusters for months, spikes in cellular protein breakdown, immune overexpression, and skin corrosion in children. It had started near the Canadian border, then appeared again in small Vermont counties. Isolated cases until they weren't. And now, here it was, Coldridge. She remembered Rachel. She remembered the burns, the refusal from BioVast to acknowledge cross-contamination. She remembered her resignation letter and the lawsuit that followed. She wouldn't let it happen again. She opened a secondary window and entered a secure channel, pulling up a map overlaid with red markers. She tapped a fresh one over Coldridge and typed, "Proximity alert, BioVast link suspected." Her lips pressed into a line. She would need to go there, in person. Back at the Harper house, the rest of the morning passed in stillness. Evie had returned to the living room floor, where she lay on her stomach coloring. Another drawing had begun to take shape, this time a cracked wall, and inside it, what looked like hundreds of small red worms coiled together. She shaded them in with the edge of a maroon crayon. Rex remained nearby, within arm's reach, occasionally lifting his head toward the ceiling as if listening. Logan crouched near the hallway floor vent, tracing the trim with his fingers. One plank felt newer than the rest, less worn, less warped. He knocked against it softly. Hollow. Beneath it, something shifted. He sat back, pulse tightening in his throat. Rex had stopped breathing, just for a second, then exhaled through his nose, tail motionless. The afternoon settled in like a held breath. A faint drizzle tapped the windows, soft and hesitant. Maggie stood in the laundry room folding towels, her movements deliberate, too quiet. Logan walked in without speaking and placed the glass vial on the table beside her. She looked at it, but her lips remained sealed, her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He watched, waiting for an answer she didn't give. As night approached, Logan returned to the hallway and sat on the floor, resting his back against the wall. He could hear Evie humming faintly from the next room, her voice more breath than melody. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the vial, turning it again and again in the waning light. Whatever lay beneath the floor, whatever had caused the marks on his daughter's skin, it wasn't over. Not yet. And something told him it hadn't even begun. The third night came, cloaked in a thicker silence, the kind that settled low in the lungs and made the walls feel closer than they were. Rain had returned, not in torrents, but in a steady whisper against the tin flashing of the roof, like the sky was murmuring its secrets into the bones of the house. Logan moved through the dim corridors with the stillness of memory, each step precise, muted. The lights glowed a soft amber, barely brushing back the dark. Upstairs, Evie slept, her breath a quiet rhythm beneath the blanket. One hand curled close to her cheek. At the foot of her bed, Rex lay coiled and watchful, ears alert even in rest. The new surveillance system blinked steadily from the cabinet in the hallway, motion-activated, infrared, time-stamped. Logan had installed it that afternoon, setting each angle with care. One tucked into the bookshelf in Evie's room, another watching the hallway, a third at the base of the stairs. All three feeds streamed to his open laptop on the kitchen counter. The screen split into narrow panes, each window showing nothing but the stillness of night. And yet, something lingered at the edge of his mind. Earlier that evening, while reviewing the logs, he'd found a gap. 17 seconds where the hallway camera had recorded nothing. No motion trigger, no flags. The system had reset. It might have been a blind spot, or something worse, someone had tampered with it. He'd memorized the time, filed it away like a splinter. Just past midnight, Rex stirred. Not a full shift, no growl or bark, just a low, guttural vibration, deep in his chest. Logan recognized the sound. He'd heard it years ago in Iraq, when the dog had sensed an ambush seconds before it broke. He stood, heart already quickening, just as the middle feed on the laptop flickered. A shape rippled through the hallway shadow on plaster, then vanished. Then came the soft click. Not a floorboard, but a latch. A window. And then Rex exploded from the bed, a blur of muscle and teeth, and hit the intruder with a snarl that tore through the house like a flare. Logan was moving before his thoughts caught up. Emergency light gripped tight as he raced upstairs. The room was chaos. Rex had the man pinned beneath the window, jaws locked on his arm, growling low. The man was young, wiry, dressed in faded hospital scrubs. In his free hand, he gripped a silver syringe. Logan didn't hesitate. He wrenched the man back and slammed him against the dresser with enough force to shake loose a drawer. The syringe clattered and rolled under the bed. Evie was awake, curled in the far corner of her mattress. She hadn't screamed, just stared, her eyes wide and glassy. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Logan moved quickly, gathering her into his arms. She was too light, too cold. Her head rested on his shoulder as she murmured about a dream walls shifting, a voice she didn't know whispering her name. The intruder writhed, muttering nonsense, but Logan caught it immediately. No ID badge, just a small patch on his sleeve, white with a triple helix symbol, barely stitched into the fabric. He took a photo, zip-tied the man's wrists, and hauled him downstairs, voice calm as he called the sheriff's private line. They'd send someone quietly. For now, Coldridge didn't need to know. He laid Evie gently on the kitchen counter, disinfected the scratch on her arm, and then froze. The marks had deepened, blooming like ink in water, curling along the veins and filaments. He lifted the collar of her shirt. The pattern continued, growing across her shoulder in thin crimson vines. His hands stilled, hovering over her skin. She flinched. A tremble passed through her small frame. Heat radiated under his palm. His jaw clenched. He forced breath through his nose, but his hands shook despite himself. The military calm he'd worn like armor was starting to fracture. Maggie appeared in the doorway, her robe drawn tight. Her gaze passed from Evie to Logan, then to the restrained man in the mudroom. Her face was pale, not just with fear, but something deeper. She stepped forward, then stopped. Her hands were trembling too, tucked deep into her sleeves. When Logan asked if she knew the man, she didn't answer, just shook her head too slowly. She approached Evie, brushing the damp hair from her temple, whispering something soft and small. Logan watched the movement of her lips, the weight in her shoulders, and felt something simmer inside him. He demanded an answer. Maggie didn't give one. Instead, she asked if the marks were worse, eyes flicking toward the drawer that held old medical records. For a heartbeat, he thought she might finally speak. But she turned and walked away. The laptop pinged. Claire Monroe's face filled the screen, lit by the cool fluorescence of a lab behind her. She looked older than in her press photos, worn at the edges, like someone who'd spent years pushing back against walls that didn't budge. A faint scar crossed one brow, a story untold but obvious. She'd received Logan's message, watched the footage. Her voice was steady but edged with urgency. She said the patterns on Evie's skin matched early immune responses from F3 experimental trials, particularly pediatric subjects. The way the redness followed venous lines, how it branched like circuitry. This was already phase 2. If so, systemic infiltration was underway. Evie needed tests, containment, fast. Logan showed her the sleeve patch. Claire's face darkened. That logo hadn't been used officially in over 7 years, not since Quebec. Its reappearance wasn't an oversight. Someone had resurrected something long buried. She would come to Coldridge herself. She didn't trust field agents anymore. When the call ended, Logan remained still, eyes on Claire's frozen image. Her calm, precise tone reminded him of the battlefield medics, those who stitched wounds without panic, just hands and skill. She would come. She would act. He stepped into the hallway again, stopped near the loose plank. For a moment, he pressed his hand to the wood, as if it might speak. Rex sat nearby, silent and steady. Logan pulled the emergency kit from behind the baseboard. Blood test supplies. He would draw samples, label them, prepare for Claire. But more than that, he would start mapping the marks, following them like a code, a language carved into his daughter's skin. Then something inside him broke. He slammed his fist into the wall, once sharp, skin splitting on impact. The sound echoed through the quiet. Rex didn't flinch, only looked up, eyes calm. Logan slid to the floor, knees to chest. His voice was a rasp. "I'm not losing her." And in the hush that followed, memory returned. Al Raqqa. 4 years back. Concrete walls, static on the radio. Rex barking at a steel door, claws scraping metal, a child's heartbeat behind it. Command had delayed, called it interference. By the time they breached, it was too late. Rex had stayed with the body, refused food, refused orders. They'd discharged him. Logan took him home, whispered into his ear, "Next time you bark, I'll believe you." Now, in this narrow hallway, the memory was more than a flashback. It was a vow. This time, they would not be too late. The rain had lifted by morning, but the earth remained sodden, the trees heavy with dew, and the sky veiled in that dull, winter-gray haze that seemed to mute sound. The house on Hawthorne Hill stood in stillness, its wooden bones quietly groaning in the cold. A single crow paced the gable like a sentinel, tilting its head now and then toward the eastern tree line. Inside, the air carried that peculiar silence born not of peace, but of dread. Claire Monroe arrived just after sunrise. She stepped from the dark blue government SUV without a word, her boots hitting the gravel with a crispness that betrayed years of learned efficiency. She was tall, lean, wrapped in a charcoal trench coat with the collar pulled high. Her face sharp-jawed, lined with fine age and sharper stress, was unreadable. A medical-grade satchel hung from one shoulder, its flap marked by the faint imprint of the old U.S. Biohazard Authority, half faded from time and disuse. Her breath fogged briefly as she scanned the front of the house, her gaze lingering on the windows, calculating angles, blind spots, escape routes. Logan met her at the threshold. He hadn't slept. The lines beneath his eyes had deepened, his stubble now fully gray along the jaw. He moved stiffly, and the dried blood on his knuckles hadn't been cleaned. Behind him, Rex stood like a statue, posture taut, eyes fixed on Claire with that wary, almost human assessment he reserved for people with authority. They didn't speak much. Claire requested access to the downstairs utility area. Logan led her through the living room, past the faded photographs and antiseptic scent, past Evie who lay curled on the couch under layers of blankets, her breath shallow but steady. Maggie sat beside her, a hand resting on the child's back like an anchor, but her eyes were somewhere else entirely. The access hatch had been hidden behind the water heater, a section of floor panel that lifted away with a tug from the right edge. Claire slipped through first, descending into the crawl space that sloped into a proper basement structure long thought to be sealed off. Her boots met concrete, and for a long moment, there was only the sound of her breath and the distant creak of floorboards above. What she found wasn't surprising, only confirming. Shelves, metal-framed and sealed, lined with glass vials, each labeled in precise, methodical handwriting: E. Harper, F3, Variant A, E. Harper, Sample 24, B, dates, dosages, increments of collection. Claire took a moment before lifting her camera. The flash flickered in brief intervals, illuminating the ghost laboratory in patches. The dust had been recently disturbed, no spiderwebs, no mildew. Someone had been down here often. She selected 3 vials and a data pad that had been left on a small bench. The screen flickered to life with a low hum. Files opened without password protection, either out of arrogance or haste. Diagrams of lymphatic response, protein bonding sequences, reaction charts marked with handwritten notes. One phrase repeated more than once. Phase 3 requires emotional destabilization. She uploaded the contents to her encrypted drive, her hands steady, but her jaw had tightened. She climbed back up without a word, placed the vials on the dining table, and began setting up the mobile analysis kit she had carried in. Maggie watched in silence as the tools were laid out: centrifuge, microanalyzer, reagent vials, a laptop with a matte black casing. She had not moved from Evie's side. Her skin looked waxen, her lips pale, as if she hadn't drawn a full breath in hours. But when Evie stirred, then suddenly sagged into unconsciousness, her small body curling inward with a low whimper, Maggie flinched violently. Logan was already beside them, checking her pulse, adjusting her blanket. But it was Maggie who began to tremble. She rose on unsteady legs, walking blindly toward the mantel, where one of Evie's drawings had been pinned, with a magnet, something Claire hadn't noticed before. The crayon lines were crude but careful, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a large sun. 2, tall, one in brown, one in yellow, and between them, a smaller girl. Beside her, a dog. In the corner, Maggie's figure stood apart, small and gray. Maggie pressed the paper to her chest like it could silence something inside her. Claire, now hunched over the analyzer, didn't look up as she spoke. The reaction markers were confirmed. Evie's blood was generating defensive proteins not known in any published human profile. The red marks weren't symptoms of illness. They were defense signals, warning flares built into her cells. Evie wasn't sick. She was resisting. Logan didn't answer immediately. His hands were fists on the table. Maggie didn't cry. She just stood there, as if her breath had turned to stone long ago. When Claire asked, she didn't reply at once. Her gaze drifted toward the empty space between the family photographs, where a flake of chipped paint clung to the wall like an excuse not to look at the truth. "I used to work for them," she said finally, her voice hoarse, each word sounding as though it was dragged up from a dream belonging to someone else. Biovast, before it all fell apart. She had been an environmental scientist, once respected, once idealistic, part of a frontline research division on biological alteration across regional ecosystems. She had spoken out against a classified study she believed to be ethically compromised. The report had been buried, the incident quietly forgotten. No one fired her. They just stopped calling. No more projects, no more emails, no explanations. A promising resume turned obsolete, a reputation slowly stripped of weight. Then she met Logan. They married not out of passion, but because broken people sometimes leaned into each other's silence. Evie was small, too young to question the sadness that hung between rooms. Maggie tried to start over, and then Biovast contacted her again. They hadn't pressured her, not at first. They spoke of a child with rare markers, a need for light monitoring, no interference, no samples, no contact, just notes, a device to track vitals, occasional drops of blood, gathered during routine visits, everything encrypted. They called it passive biological observation. She said no, but then they referenced old agreements, clauses she had signed. They didn't threaten her. They didn't have to. She knew how the system worked. She knew that once a door had been opened, it never truly closed, so she nodded. The sky above Coldridge had turned a bruised violet by nightfall, the kind of color that warned of storms not just in weather, but in fate. A quiet wind curled through the trees, brushing their branches against one another like old bones remembering touch. The temperature had dropped, sharp enough to kiss breath into clouds. In the house, the lights had been dimmed again, not for stealth, but for necessity. Evie slept better that way. Her body had begun to resist the normal rhythms of rest. Even in sleep, she twitched, fingers curling into fists without cause. The red lines on her arms no longer simply followed veins. They pulsed faintly now, as if something inside her was learning to breathe. Claire Monroe moved through the hallway with clipped focus. She had arrived only hours earlier, her lean figure folded into a parka too large for her frame, her face worn and elegant in the way only those who had known years of bitter clarity could be. Claire had once been a rising star in immunogenetic bioinformatics, before whistleblowing cost her a career and nearly her freedom. Her mouth rarely smiled, her hands never trembled. She and Logan had converted the guest room into a makeshift lab. Vials lined the windowsill, half filled with samples, notes, maps, blood charts. The emergency test kit she'd brought from the university lab had already yielded preliminary readings. Evie's system was producing an anomalous enzyme structure, something only seen in Phase 2 F3 anomalies. Claire had seen it once before, in a child who hadn't survived. That memory shaped every move she made. They planned to act the next evening. Claire had reached out to a contact in Federal Biosafety Enforcement, Agent Callum Breck, a middle-aged veteran with a salt and pepper beard and eyes like broken glass. He would arrive by morning with a team, but they hadn't expected what came next. It started with Rex, just past 2 a.m. Last, the dog rose from the foot of Evie's bed without a sound, body stiffening not with confusion, but certainty. Logan, half asleep on the hallway cot, saw the shift. He sat up. Rex's ears were high, shoulders rigid, the hairs down his back lifting one by one, like triggered tripwires. Then came the growl, not loud, not showy, but low and primal. Logan reached instinctively for the weapon under the blanket. From beneath the floorboards came a vibration, not loud, but real, the kind that traveled through bones. Claire had just stepped into the hallway with a clipboard when the sound cracked through the base of the stairs, wood splintering as a figure burst through the loose panel, dragging something heavy behind him. He wore a dark hoodie, stained in streaks of chemical grit. His face was pale, almost waxen, eyes too bright, hands gloved in surgical blue. A familiar patch clung to his shoulder white, with the triple helix now outlined in red thread. Rex launched without hesitation, his body colliding with the figure in the narrow hallway, jaws snapping toward the attacker's dominant arm. The man screamed short, stifled, then threw Evie's blanket toward Logan, buying half a second of cover before lunging again, syringe gleaming in his hand. Logan tackled him mid-swing, forcing the weapon down, but the man twisted, slicing along Logan's bicep before slipping free. Blood spattered the floor. Claire moved fast, too fast for someone her size, grabbing the emergency stun unit from her belt and jabbing it into the man's side. His body convulsed, then sagged, but not before flinging the syringe toward Evie's room. It spun in the air like a glinting whisper. Rex caught it. The glass cracked between his teeth, splintering inside his mouth. But he did not drop it. Instead, the dog turned and barreled down the hall, head low, bleeding. Then the man pulled something else from his coat. A second syringe larger, filled with fluid that shimmered blue under the stairlight. He lunged toward Evie's door, and Rex bleeding from the mouth, hind leg dragging, threw himself between the man and the threshold. The needle plunged not into a child's skin, but deep into the furred muscle of a German shepherd's flank. The scream that followed didn't come from the attacker. It came from Maggie. She had appeared at the top of the stairs, eyes swollen from sleeplessness, hair tangled across her face. And for the first time since the beginning, her voice did not tremble. It split the air like glass. No! It wasn't a word. It was a fracture in the world. She ran to Rex, dropped beside him, her robe falling open as she pulled his heavy body onto her lap. Blood soaked through her clothes, through her knees, but she didn't move. She cradled his head in shaking hands and whispered his name like a prayer. Evie stirred. Her room had remained untouched in the scuffle, but now the child stepped into the hallway, her nightgown fluttering around her knees. She said nothing. Her feet were bare on the cold floor. Then, gently, she knelt beside Rex. Her small hand reached forward, trembling not from fear, but from knowing. And then she touched the dog's paw, bloodied, twitching. "You're my friend," she whispered. Claire pressed the stun unit again, this time with both hands. The man dropped hard, twitching once. Logan kicked the syringe down the stairs, then dragged the attacker by his collar into the mudroom, where he zip-tied his ankles and wrists and dropped him against the washer. Outside, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath. Back inside, Maggie sat still, soaked in red, her face streaked with something older than grief. Evie leaned against her side, eyes open. Rex's breathing was shallow, ragged. Claire moved in quickly, checking the wound, the vitals. It wasn't fatal, not yet. But the fluid was foreign, experimental. Claire needed analysis, needed her lab, needed time. Logan watched the scene from the threshold. Evie curled against her mother, Rex's head resting on both their laps. Claire working with steady hands, and the storm rising behind the windows like a chorus of the past demanding justice. Something had broken that night, but something else had healed. Morning arrived in a hush, soft and golden, as if the storm had scrubbed the world clean. The clouds that had weighed heavy over Coldridge for days now drifted apart like worn veils, revealing a sky rinsed in clarity. In the backyard, dew clung to the brittle grass, and the last of the autumn leaves glowed amber beneath the low sun. A hush had settled over the house, not the silence of dread, but something more like reverence. Evie woke just before dawn, her breath steady, her skin cool. The red filaments had faded during the night, leaving only pale echoes along her veins like brushstrokes from a dream that no longer wished to be remembered. Her eyes blinked open slowly, finding light instead of shadow. At her bedside, Rex lay curled on a thick blanket, his breathing shallow but even. A neat line of stitches crossed his flank, the surrounding fur trimmed close and smeared with antiseptic. He stirred when Evie moved, his tail thudding weakly against the floor. Claire sat nearby, her posture folded but awake, a mug of black coffee in her hand, gone long cold. Her eyes, once sharp, now tired, watched both child and dog, with a vigilance honed by too many losses. Her work was nearly done. Tests had confirmed the injection contained a last-stage variant of the F3 compound, altered for rapid induction, but Rex's metabolism, massive and resilient, had absorbed enough of it to stop the compound from reaching Evie. He had taken the worst of it, again. Downstairs, Logan paced the length of the living room, the floor creaking beneath his boots in slow rhythm. His arm had been stitched and wrapped by Claire hours earlier, but the bandage was already stained. A stack of evidence lay on the coffee table: syringes, vials, test results, security footage, and the torn patch with the triple helix symbol. Claire had made her report to Federal Biosafety Enforcement. Project F3 had been declared compromised, its actors either detained or in hiding. By noon, Agent Callum Breck and his team would arrive to debrief, secure the site, and begin dismantling what remained of BioVast's shadow operations. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded tight, knuckles white. She had spoken little since the night before, except to ask to testify. She would speak to the investigators, she said, about the surveillance agreements, the silent consent, the things she hadn't stopped. Her voice had lost the tremor. In its place was something cleaner, stripped of self-preservation. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the shape of redemption. Outside, the wind picked up gently, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and frost-bitten earth. It curled around the porch where Rex had once watched squirrels with mild indifference, where Logan had once sat, unread letters in hand. Now, the porch held something else, a carved wooden box sealed with Logan's military insignia. Inside were the digital backups Claire had created, encrypted files, medical reports, lab scans, testimonies, all of it ready for transfer. Logan would deliver it himself, hand to hand, and then he would be done. But first, there was something else to do. He walked upstairs slowly, pausing outside Evie's room. Through the door, he heard faint movement, scratching, the whisper of crayons against paper. When he entered, Evie looked up, eyes bright with that soft, unfurling trust children offer once and never again. She was drawing. At her side, Rex dozed, a faint tremor running through his paw each time she leaned near. Her picture was simple: a man in a tan coat, a girl with blonde hair, and a dog with a stitched side standing in a field of leaves. Above them, a single phrase, scrawled in Evie's uneven hand: "Never let go." Logan sat on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet fill the space between them. She handed him the drawing without a word. He took it, and something caught in his throat. Later that day, the house was quieter than it had been in weeks. Rex rested in a sunlit patch on the floor, his body limp with healing sleep. Claire packed her equipment in measured silence, her hair tied back, her notes organized with near-ritual precision. She turned once to Logan and said she would return, not for the case, but to visit, if that was allowed. Logan nodded. Maggie stood by the door when Agent Breck arrived. A tall man with a face lined by wind and disappointment. Breck said little. He nodded at Maggie, took the evidence, asked only if the child was safe. Logan answered yes. 3 weeks passed. By early December, the last of the golden leaves had fallen, leaving the trees bare and the air tinged with winter's breath. The town of Coldridge carried on, unchanged in its bones, but somehow gentler in its silence. Evie walked again without fear. The marks never returned. Logan filed final paperwork that month documents founding the Rex Foundation. Its mission: to protect children affected by unauthorized biological experimentation, to advocate for survivors, and to build a record of voices too long ignored. Claire joined as its scientific advisor. Maggie, its first witness. Rex became its symbol. They used a photo Evie had taken. Rex sitting beside her in the grass, head tilted, eyes on her as if no world beyond existed. On the foundation's letterhead, beneath the logo, ran the words, "Because someone must believe the bark." The house remained the same, its porch creaked, the kitchen window still stuck halfway, and the upstairs hallway still smelled faintly of cedar and old books. But something had changed, not in structure, in breath. On the last day of fall, Logan found Evie on the porch with Rex. She was sketching again, this time with colored pencils. He asked what she was drawing. She pointed toward the trees. The picture showed 3 figures walking toward the sun: a soldier, a child, and a dog, their shadows long, their steps unhurried. Above them, in golden crayon, Evie had written, "We're not lost." Sometimes the greatest battles happen in silence in homes, in hearts, in the quiet pain no one sees. This story reminds us to trust our instincts, protect the ones who can't speak for themselves, and never ignore the small signs. If this touched you, please like, share, and subscribe for more. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever sensed something was wrong, even when no one else believed you? Tell me in the comments below.